Okay, so again, why do I call this a cultural theory of regimes or political orders? Because mentality structures take center stage in that theory. What I also try to do here is bring together the cool water idea with the previous human empowerment model that I had before. So we start from the top and move to the bottom of that picture. As you know my work, you will not be surprised that I always start my thinking from basic existential conditions. So this is, of course, prevalent material conditions that we find in a given society. Are people poor or rich? Are people educated or illiterate? Are they secure, or is there a lot of crime and violence, and so on and so forth? So basic living conditions are a starting point of my thinking. And I do believe that the cool water environment comes in here. So to repeat that again, that means the combination of two thermal climatic features and two hydrological, so water related features. The two thermal features are, we have temporarily but not permanently frosty winters combined with relatively cool summers. And the two water components are that precipitation is continuous throughout all the seasons, so there is no dry season, and water reservoirs like the sea or lakes or rivers or ponds or whatever are pretty ubiquitous, so they are everywhere. So if these elements go together, this is what I call the cool water condition or the cool water environment. And this can be measured on a scale from 0 to 1. And it's a continuous scale. It's not like dichotomous. It's either or. It's a spectrum. And I'm arguing that the more this cool water condition is given in a society, the more will resources be distributed in a diffuse manner. You could also say they are decentral. Water itself will be very diffuse and decentral. No one can control water supply in a strongly cool water condition. And that also makes other resources that are derivatives of water also diffuse. Think of the value of land. When you have cool water conditions, you drain a swamp, you clear a forest, and you will have valuable land where you can grow something. In areas where there's a lot of aridity, where water might be only found in oases, so at very fixed spots, the value of land will also be fixed and will not be diffuse. So when cool water conditions are weak or not there at all, resources tend to be fixed. If the cool water condition is pronounced, resources tend to be diffuse. There's a lot of theories in economics that say that if we have diffuse resources, this is something that will feed the social fabric of a society with autonomies. So there will be local autonomies, so decentral power structures, multipolar power structures, power sharing institutions. So we will have local autonomies, we will have sectoral autonomies, we will have corporate autonomies. Think, for instance, Northwestern Europe in the medieval age, organizations like the merchant guilds, the East India companies, or the Hanseatic League, as an example, were private organizations that were very powerful, yeah, and very autonomous also in their self-administration and self-governance and all these kinds of things. If we have the opposite, if we have fixed resources, this will be something that will feed the social fabric with hierarchies. Yeah? So these are the two kind of polar configurations we can think about. And I do believe that they link to certain or make certain mentality modes prevalent. If we are in the left configuration, which is labeled in its totality as human impairment or restriction, the prevalent mentality mode will be something that I call here intimidation. Why? Because in order to defend, to justify, to legitimize the hierarchies, you have to make people who are subordinate in those hierarchies appease with those hierarchies. So what we will find is cosmologies, religions that say something about the divine order, that will teach people that the hierarchies that exist, with elites having lots of power over land and people, that this is the divine order, and people will be intimidated. So for instance, one example is, if you don't obey to this order, if you think you can oppose or rebel, you lose your ticket to salvation and you will land in hell. So this is a typical psychological instrument that has been used in most of the major religions in the past, in order to make people feel at peace with very strict hierarchies in those, we think of all the agrarian empires in China, in India, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. And of course, this mentality mode, intimidation, that is something that feeds authoritarian values, which emphasize coercion, and they also emphasize certain in-group, out-group relationships. So there's a very strong emphasis on the in-group. So this is favoritism. In-group favoritism, out-group discrimination is a very prevalent pattern. And so this is in the horizontal dimension of human interaction. People that are unequal make very strict distinctions between in-group and out-group. In the vertical dimension of human interaction, it's of course because the hierarchies, coercion is a very strong element here. And the third one is clientelism. You always need a personal bond to make an interaction work. You still can see this today if you go into other parts of the world outside the West. When you think about business practices in certain countries, when you go in the Middle East, you usually have to have an opulent dinner or carousal to make a deal. So you need to create these personal bonds, and this is what I mean with this clientelism. And if you have these authoritarian values prevalent in society, this lends legitimacy to a particular type of regime, and that's autocracy. If we go again to the right-hand side of the spectrum, the mentality mode under diffuse resources with autonomies as the major structuring element of the society is not intimidation, but quite the opposite, encouragement. People are encouraged to use initiative, to try something out, to explore, to invent, to invest in all these kinds of things. And what that is feeding is the opposite of authoritarian values, namely what I call emancipative values. And here we also have three pillars: liberty, impartiality, which is the opposite of favoritism, and then contractarianism rather than clientelism. So people treat each other on the basis of contract, of agreement, and not on the basis of whether we have a shared ancestry or lineage. In this configuration, where emancipative values are strong, we will also see that social relationships, well, or let me put it like this, we find that humans are a group animal, and that will never change. And that means we will always depend on groups, so this will never change. We will always have some form of social capital. So social capital will never vanish, opposite to what Robert Putnam is saying. However, the types of social capital, the types of social alliances are very different in these two different modes, or these two different configurations, or under these two different values. When we have authoritarian values, our social alliances will mostly be based on shared ancestry or lineage. And we will find these quasi-tribalistic forms of thinking in groups. So we'll have tribalism, familism, nationalism. They always make a very strong in-group, out-group separation. When we are under emancipative values, people still coalesce, join forces with each other, but on the basis of agreement, on the basis of consent, on the basis of contracts and formal agreements, and not on the basis of lineage, familism, kinship bonds, and these kinds of things. And here, a different type of political regime will be considered most legitimate, and that is democracy. So what this whole model is trying to argue, that free configurational elements of society, someone is talking in between here, namely existential conditions, mentality modes, and regime institutions tend to go together in a society in ways that are mutually compatible or congruent with each other, and that infuses into social configuration some element of stability. We will see basic major changes like revolutions, or as a society implodes or breaks down, collapses, such things that break the stability, we will usually see when one of these three elements gets out of equilibrium with the other two. That will always create a moment of instability then that prepares a society for implosion, collapse, or revolution. So that's this element of the theory. I navigate you now to a different slide. It's not so well organized in terms of the sequence here. I want you to go or to look at slide number 3. This needs a little bit of explanation here. What do we see here? On the horizontal axis, it's a time. It's time. It's years depicted from 1960 to, now I don't see the right end, to 2010. And on the vertical axis, you see the scale of emancipative values, which you know has a theoretical scaling. From 0 is the theoretical low point, and 1.0 is the theoretical maximal point. Of course, if we have entire populations, you will never see any society at the extreme ends, because that would mean that in a given survey, everyone who has been interviewed would, on all 12 items that go into this index, be on the upmost emancipatory end, and that is almost impossible. It's logically possible, but for all practical purposes, it's very unlikely. But still, we see that societies fill quite a substantial range of the possible variation. And we see here the world is broken up into the culture zones that I have used in the in Freedom Rising. So I do not go into much detail explaining them here. I think they're rather self-explanatory. One remark may be the culture zone averages here are the averages across the countries that belong into these cultural zones. However, I did it with population weights. That means populations are weighted for their proportional size in their given culture zone. So if we think about the scenic East, the population of China contributes to the average of the scenic East by about 10 times as much as the population of Japan, because China has more than 1 billion people and Japan has 120 or so million people. So China has approximately 10 times as many people. Therefore, the average for the scenic East is depending 10 times as much on China's average score compared to Japan's average score, just to clarify that here. And this is important if we want to make representative inferences. Now, some of you will think, okay, we have yearly measures here of emancipative values in every year for all these culture zones from 1960 to 2010. This must raise some questions, because the World Value Survey didn't start to do surveys before 1983. And we also have not done the survey annually. We just completing the 7th wave of the survey. So we should have at most 7 points in time where we can see where the values of a given country or culture zone are located in a given year. So how could I produce these data? This is something that needs a little explanation. So what I did here is I estimated a country's score in emancipative values for past years. And what I did is basically to go to a recent cross-section where we did the survey and look at the age differences. And we all know that in most countries, the younger people are more emancipatory than the older people. And usually this is a continuous distribution. So that opens the possibility to transpose emancipative values in terms of birth cohort differences into an annual time series. So I can backward estimate a country's emancipative values back in time from current cohort differences. And why is this justified? I think it is justified because we know pretty much for certain, in fact, that the cohort differences in a given cross-section in emancipative values, with younger cohorts emphasizing these values more than older cohorts. That's the basic pattern. That this is not a life cycle effect. We know that for sure, because we know from those countries that participated in all 7 waves of the World Value Survey that the cohorts, as they aged over time, did not become less emancipatory. So the cohorts keep their set points that they once have received after the formative phase of socialization has ended. So it is indeed cohort differences and not life cycle dynamics that we see when we see age differences. So this was one consideration. The other consideration was that I looked into the age distribution in the different surveys that we have done in different parts of the world. And it occurred that the age between 35 and 40 is, so to speak, often the gravity point of the age distribution that we find in our survey. So most people, or the modal person, is in many countries at around 35 of her or his age. And this would very often in many of the age distributions also be the median or the average. So this is kind of a good representation of the central tendency when we look at age. So 35 is, so to speak, a little bit of my fixed point. Also for another reason, when people have reached the age of 35, we can be sure that they are, or that they have finalized their formative phase of socialization. So that means the values that we have by then are most likely the values that they will keep for the rest of their lives. Therefore, I think the age of 35 is a good projection point or projection age for the backward estimation of emancipative values. So to give you an example, imagine we have a survey in Luxembourg, and we have done this survey in the year 2000. And then, of course, we have people in the survey. If we have 2,000 respondents, different people have different birth years. And then I calculate averages in emancipative values, always for those people who have the same birth year. So people born in 1980, people born in 1981, 82, 83, and so on. Now think about it. We have done the survey in the year 2000. And I have a couple of people in Luxembourg who are born in the year 1980. Let's say 50 people in this survey have been born in 1980. So now I calculate the average emancipative value score of those people born in 1980. Now my question is, when are these people 35 years old? I have interviewed them in the year 2000, so they are not even 35 years old. Actually, they are 20. So they will be 35 years old in the year 2015. And this is my projection. Now I transpose the average score in emancipative values of those Luxembourgians born in 1980 into the year 2015. And that is Luxembourg's average value score for the year 2015. Another example, now we look at the people that we have interviewed again in the year 2000 in Luxembourg. Some of them, let's say 60, have been born in 1950. So I calculate the average emancipative value score for those Luxembourgians born in 1950. Now the question is, when are those people 35 years of age? Well, that would be in 1985. So I project their score into the year 1985. And this is then Luxembourg's average emancipative value score for the year 1985. And that's a projection because we didn't do a survey in Luxembourg in 1985. But these are those kinds of projections. So this is the basic idea, to transpose cohort differences into yearly difference to produce a time series data set. Actually cross-sectional time series data set that we can use for relatively sophisticated panel regressions. And I do this for every country. And therefore, I get for every country a time series of emancipative values from 1960 to 2010. If we go further back, I can actually go further back to 1960, but then the cases in the cells are becoming too small to provide a, let's say, halfway reliable projection. Now there's two more adjustments to this. Is the basic projection that I do, but now two steps of adjustment are necessary. One is, we also know there's a second component in the rise of emancipative values. It's not only generational succession that is driving the process of rising emancipative values. We also know there is a temporal, a period component, a trend component. Emancipative values have also been rising among people belonging to the same cohort. And that means if I'm not taking this into consideration, my backward estimations are too, or are inflated when people have been under the time trend. So if the further back the estimation goes, the longer have people been under the imprint of the time trend, okay? And therefore I have a trend adjustment component in the projection, and the further back in time it goes, the more I discount or deflate the projection. And I have looked, the average rate of increase over time is 0.1 in 10 years. 0.1 in 10 years. But that again is only true for the average of Western societies. For non-Western societies, that trend factor has been less pronounced. And that means I have to make that trend factor not similar across all countries, but I have to make it country specific. And this is done by looking at the base level of emancipative values today. The highest base level we find in Sweden by far. But we also know that Sweden had the biggest increase over time in those values. And that means we can assume that the higher the base level is, the stronger has been the emancipatory trend in a given country. So I'm using the base level to weight the trend subtraction that is in the formula, and that means the higher the base level, the stronger is that trend subtraction. And this creates, as you can see, a reality where the cultural zones, if you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, of the line diagram, you see that the lines are much closer to each other than they are on the right-hand side, so at the end point of our observation period. So my projection works in a way that creates a reality in which societies have been more similarly traditional, let me put it like this, or less emancipative in the past than they are today. And I think that's quite plausible. Think of the issue of homosexuality, which is one of the items in the Emancipative Values Index. Even in Sweden, in the 1950s, for instance, homosexuality was largely a taboo. Even in the by then culturally progressive societies like the Netherlands or Sweden, even they would have appeared decades back rather conservative when it comes to those items. Okay, so much for that. This is interesting because you can imagine now, I have made these estimations, and this creates a data set when I have these estimations for 100 countries for 50 years. I have a time-pooled cross-sectional data set with 5,000 observations. And that can truly be used for panel regressions, where we then can look whether values measured earlier are a driver, for instance, of democracy measured later, or is it the other way around? So we can make these causal tests where we use temporal order in a before and after sequencing logic in order to see which of the elements of human empowerment is driving which one in the evolution over time. Now, coming back to the theory, I wish to relate you now to slide number 4. No, sorry, slide number 5. I have to look at my watch. Okay, I have 10, 15 minutes left. Slide number 5. And I want to relate you to the upper hand slide, because this is now the core of what I wanted to talk about. And I have to explain what you see on the horizontal axis. And here I introduce the concept of regime, culture, misfits. Again, regime, culture, misfits. So what is that? It tries to measure the degree to which political regime, political order, and the given culture are incompatible, incongruent with each other, so to speak, misfitting. In what sense? Well, I look at regimes in terms of the level of democracy. So the level of democracy measured on a scale from 0, there is no democracy, to 1.0, it's perfect democracy. And 0.5 would mean we are in a perfect hybrid stage. It's mixed autocracy, democracy. So this is the one component, the regime component, level of democracy, from absent to present. The culture component is a country's, a population's average score in emancipative values. And now I want to calculate how much are they fitting or how much are they misfitting. How do I do that? Very simple. I run a regression in which I regress as the dependent variable the country's level of democracy on the population's average score in emancipative values. So this is the independent variable. And then what I'm doing is I'm saving from this regression the residuals. The residuals. And this is what we see here. This is the residuals when I regress the level of democracy on a population's score, average score in emancipative values. And of course, as you know, in a regression, I mean, the residuals are the unpredicted parts, yeah, of the dependent variable. What is that part of the dependent variable, in this case, democracy, that is unpredicted or unrelated to emancipative values. So that's the misfit. And that misfit can be negative, and it can be differently, in different degrees, be negative, or it can be positive, and to different degrees being positive. And when it is negative, that means that the level of democracy is lower than what the score in emancipative values of that population at that point in time would suggest or predicts. So the level of democracy is lower relative to the level of emancipative values. In other words, the country is too autocratic relative to the regime is too autocratic relative to what its surrounding culture would suggest. Of course, the misfit can go in the other direction. Positive residuals mean the level of democracy is higher than what the level of emancipative values predict. And that means the country is actually too democratic relative to its surrounding culture. Now, when I take this misfit, always like how large and in what direction was that misfit pointing 30 years ago, so a generation ago. Yeah, so that is t minus 30, what I see on the horizontal axis. In this case, I can do t minus 30 for different points in time. In this case, it's exemplary. In this case, t minus 30 is the year 1980. 1980. On the vertical axis, I now measure the change in the level of democracy 30 years following when the misfit was measured. So this means I measure here change in the level of democracy from 1980 to 2010. So that's a 30-year time stretch. I worked with different time spans to measure that change. I worked with 5-year time spans, 10-year time spans, 15, 20. It turned out that the best predictions of regime change are always achieved when the time span is 30 years. And that's not implausible because that's roughly the length of a generation. So what I can say here, if I know in which direction and to what degree the regime culture misfit was pointing 30 years ago, I can get a very good prediction how regime change would look like in the time span of a generation. And we see that the regime changes, you see this horizontal line in the picture. Most regime changes are above the horizontal line, and this is simply a reflection of the democratic trend over recent decades, or what Huntington called waves of democratization. So there are many more cases of democratization than there are cases of autocratization. But Russia is below the line, as you can see. Russia is more autocratic in 2010 than it was in 1980. So negative changes mean countries move towards autocracy, and the most obvious case is Venezuela, where it started under Chavez, and Maduro is not any better. And then positive changes mean this is a move towards democracy. And now what can we see from this figure? If a regime culture misfit is such that a country has been too autocratic, what will happen after that is it most likely triggers a regime change towards democracy If the country has been too democratic, we will see a change towards autocracy. And that is very interesting, because what it shows to us is that regime change operates as a function, as a correcting function, or as a correction of regime culture misfits that once have accrued. And I believe the dynamic is such that we can talk about a tectonic tension release model, like a volcano eruption. You know how this works? Tectonic plates are moving aside each other, and that creates tectonic tension, and that builds up and builds up and builds up in a glacial manner over time until an earthquake releases the tension, and the tension evaporates. So the release, the sudden thing that happens here, the regime change, which usually happens at one point in time, at a very particular point in time, is kind of this release of the tension that has been accrued. And the driving force of building up the tectonic tension is, of course, the value change. Because we know that the value change is not a process like regime change that is temporally pointed, but sudden, like a rupture. It is a very glacial process. It happens slowly, but continuously. So the ascendance in emancipative values is a force that creates a growing tension towards the regime that becomes, relative to the values, more and more too autocratic, until then a regime change happens in which the tension releases, and then the misfit is, so to speak, resolved. In the next slide, you can also see I have now the regime change in the upper slide on the horizontal axis, and I have the change in the regime culture misfit, and the change in the misfit can be an increase in the misfit or a decrease in the misfit. And we see when the regime change goes towards democracy, so towards the right side on the horizontal, the regime culture misfit tends to decrease because it goes low, it goes down. It's a negative relationship. And that shows that regime change operates as a correcting function of regime culture misfits, and therefore culture is the driving force behind regime changes. And that is another reason why I'm calling this a cultural theory of political orders. Now, to make this a little bit more practical, when we think in terms of how is this happening in reality, I would argue that when regime culture misfits grow, what this means is it creates an opportunity window for counter elites to join forces and then campaign and mobilize the population in support for a regime change that turns the given regime into the opposite direction of its misfit to the culture. In practical terms, populists, Hungary under Orban is the best example. In previous predictions, also in the book I had with Ron, Hungary and also Romania appeared too democratic relative to the level of emancipative values in those societies. So those societies had lower emancipative values, and they appeared to be too democratic relative to those values. Well, they all introduced through the Communiqué Accord, European Union, they had to adopt democratic institutions, an independent judiciary, rule of law, and all these kinds of things at a level that the European Union requires. And actually they established it at a level higher than the population's level supports. So guys like Orban or the Kaczynskis in Poland recognized, they had an intuition for that regime culture misfit and mobilized the population in support of a movement that turns the regime into the opposite direction of its misfit. Well, when it was too democratic, you turn it a little bit more towards autocracy. And this is what we just saw in the recent EU Commission's report about the state of rule of law in the European countries. And Hungary and Poland and Romania and Bulgaria came out as the countries where the situation is problematic. And these are the countries where populist forces, right-wing populist forces, did change the regimes, made restrictions of press freedom, media freedom, and the independent judiciary, as we all know. All right, this is pretty much 45 minutes, and I will then leave it here. And I'm very curious what you guys think. Thank you.
So, thank you, Chris, for your presentation. So we already have some questions in the and comments in the chat. Can you see them?
Let me see.
Or I can read them for you.
Wait a moment. Back to meeting. Okay.
So if somebody has a question, please raise your hand, because we have many participants. I can't see everybody.
All right, so I'm waiting.
So, are there any questions? Maybe you can repeat the questions also from the chat to make the discussion or like more.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat that I also find might be helpful. The last one from M. Filipov. Could you please explain a little more how related are the first argument about the importance of the initial historical conditions and the second argument about the misfits, residuals, between projected levels of culture and democracy? For example, how is the Hungarian case related to the initial historical conditions here?
Yeah. You can just send me an email. I'll give you the link. Okay.
To the question that Edward just posed, you need to be a little bit more specific about what you mean with the initial historic conditions in Hungary. When is initial? Is that in 1980 or in 1900 or?
No, I think the question is about the cool water condition and how it is related to this second part of your presentation, which is the analysis of the misfits between the culture and the regime. So in the second part of your presentation, you pointed to Poland and Hungary, but does it have anything to do with the cool water condition in either Poland or Hungary?
Okay, in a sense, yes, because my argument would be that stronger cool water conditions are responsible for setting countries on emancipatory trajectories that are running on a steeper slope and a higher intercept. And you see that very clearly. If you look in Northwestern Europe, we have the cool water scores are highest for the Scandinavian countries, for the British Islands, for Iceland, for Northern France, Northern Germany. So the European Northwest is where we find in the world the highest cool water scores, followed by those countries' settler colonies in North America, in New Zealand and the southeast of Australia and Tasmania, So there's fewer regions on the southern hemisphere because there's much less land mass. And within Europe, we find a similar gradient. The more we move southward or eastward from the European Northwest, the cool water scores go down. And that means that Poland and Hungary have a lower cool water score than most Western European countries. And that means, in turn, that their trajectory in emancipative values is on a lower base level and on a flatter, more flat slope. And that means that those countries are not as emancipatory in their cultures, and therefore the level of democracy that has been introduced with joining the European Union was artificially put on a higher level than the culture in those countries would support, and therefore populism was successful in at least partially turning those countries back towards, I mean, they are not totally autocracies, but they became in degrees, again, more autocratic. And right now they are in equilibrium with their culture. Again, as sad as we might find this as friends of democracy, but that's the reality.
Thank you. I hope this is a satisfactory answer to the person who asked the question. Also in the chat, there has been a small discussion involving several people, including, by the way, Misha Minkov, who I would like to welcome in particular because, well, this is a potentially new scholarly advisor in our lab, pending the approval of our 3-year report. Anyway, they were discussing whether India is a democracy, because obviously it is considered democracy by most people, maybe not necessarily yourself, but at the same time its value system is kind of different, and nor does it satisfy the cool water condition. So the first part of your argument with respect to India seems to be working. The second part, there's probably, it requires a little bit extra explanation why India is not a perfect democracy.
Right. This relates back to an older discussion we had a couple of years ago. Ron and I and Amy at this time, we created an index that was very controversial among political scientists because we measured democracy in a novel fashion, and we called this index, that the new index that we created, we baptized it effective democracy. So we did not just want to measure a country's level of democracy just so, but actually its effective level of democracy. What have we done in order to do so? We created a conditional index that measures democracy, and that means now Freedom House, for instance, civil liberties and political rights, that measures those elements that define democracy on the condition that they are put into practice. And for that, we used indicators of law enforcement. And when a country scored well, and India does score pretty well on Freedom House, where it is clearly a free country. However, if you look at its law enforcement performance, it looks pretty bad. And we gave, the index was created in such a way that a country's democracy score is deflated depending on how bad its rule of law or law enforcement performance is. So in India ended up, we had a scale from 0 to 1. I just love 0 to 1 scales. India had a score of 0 to 1. The score range is 0 to 1. If you measure it in that manner on Freedom House, India will end up with a score at like 0.8. So it's pretty high up, close to the maximum in the upper quartile. After our treatment in measuring effective democracy, India fell down in effective democracy to 0.3. So that's a dramatic drop. And it was as low then as Singapore. For other reasons, of course, because Singapore didn't get a high score because it is not a democracy. It's a hegemonial party system. It is good in law enforcement, but that cannot produce a good score in effective democracy if you are not a democracy in the first place. India does not get a good democracy score, not because it's not a democracy, but because its law enforcement is so bad. So two different reasons can lead to the similar low score. And this was discussed among many political scientists that, no, India is a democracy, you are treating it much too badly. Now, if you look into the VDEM data, which are around since 10 years, you will see that their scoring of India's level of democracy or quality of democracy, to put it like that, is very close to our effective democracy index back in time. And if we look or regress India's effective level of democracy on where its population's emancipative values are on average, it's on the regression line. So there is actually no regime culture misfit, there's a pretty high fit. In other words, India is not doing so well on the quality criteria as a democracy because the emancipative values of the population are still on the rather traditional side.
Okay,
and that in turn fits a relatively low score on cool water index.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Margarita Fabricant, who says, you mentioned nationalism as an opposite to the emancipative values. Recently, there's been a revival of the idea of using nationalism as a tool to make the liberalism, which is allegedly too cold an ideology, to become more inspiring and emotionally attractive by using some nationalist rhetoric. So what do you think about this idea?
I agree. Nationalism, I would make a bigger, open a bigger category where I would put in nationalism, but also religion and other cults of collective identity that go in the direction to serve our tribal psychology in making a strict in-group, out-group boundary borders and separations and divisions. And then you can create these rally around the flag effects that serve authoritarian leaders. There is a figure in the slideshow, it's slide number 11, where you would see that usually education on the individual level now, in different countries, education usually has a positive effect on emancipative values. That's pretty logical. I've always argued what education does or should do with people is making them capable to think for themselves. Yeah, at least that's what we hope from education. So making people capable to think for themselves. If people have learned to think for themselves, they no longer want to be told what to do and what to believe. So the need for doctrinal guidance by elites goes down, and then people will find natural appeal in emancipative values. And that's the force of nature. You don't need a political program or an orchestrated strategy to give rise to those values if populations have learned to think for themselves. I call this usually cognitive mobilization. Now you see here that effect actually works. Education does have a positive effect on emancipative values in most countries. However, nationalism diminishes the strength of this effect. It's a negative relationship. And I can show similar figures for where religion and religiosity is stronger. We would then also see that the enlightening effects of education are diminishing. So you are right, nationalism and anti-Western geopolitical identities in countries that have a geopolitical mission that challenges the West, and to those countries belong Russia and belong China. Those are creating psychological shields that make the emancipatory effects of modernization processes and outcomes, such as education, weaker. They operate against those emancipatory tendencies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question is from Plamen Akaliski. He writes, I think China is the elephant in the room here. What does the model say about the direction it will take?
Okay. Hi, Plamen. Thanks for the question. The model would say, or currently we haven't seen that before, but we see it now, that with the passage of time and with the rise of education, emancipative values are on the rise in China as well. And we see this in more recent surveys stronger than in the earlier surveys that we have done. This is in line with the theory. What it predicts for the future is that there is building up a regime culture misfit. The country is becoming gradually, relative to its surrounding culture, too autocratic if it continues to be as it is. I just think we have not yet reached that critical threshold that this regime culture misfit is so large that political actors, social movements form in order to fill that opening up opportunity window. And no one can tell, of course, how much time it still will take, but we can say the forces are already operating in that direction.
If I may follow up on Plamen's question, and going back to your cool water condition idea, China is huge, and of course there is probably geographical differences in values, and I wonder if you tried to establish those. It may be a very particular partial question, but first, China is so big and so important that it might be interesting in itself. And secondly, it would nicely support your idea if you were able to show that, you know, in some areas that that have higher scores on cold water conditions in China, the values are more emancipatory than in other areas.
We have done something like this with the help of Maria Kravtsova for Russian Empire with the 98 gubernatorial districts, the oblasts,
right,
where we could establish that alongside growing cool water conditions inside Russia, we see emancipatory effects that have a lot to do with family structures, female reproductive autonomy, and values as well. So this is one thing. For China, we haven't replicated this analysis, but there is a guy called Thalheim, who is the representative of the, how is it called, the rice collectivism theory, which they have evidenced in China also with the border between the rice and the wheat cultivating area. And the wheat cultivating area is more individualistic in its orientation, and the rice cultivating area is more collectivistic in its orientation, and that is still demonstrable with current data, not just historic data. If you look at where the wheat regions are and where the rice regions are, it's also a border line in terms of where we have rather stronger and where we have rather weaker with water conditions, because the rice cultivating area is more in the south and then the wheat is more in the north, and the north has stronger cool water conditions. We also have to consider, of course, that cool water conditions vary within countries, and there are some countries where there are relatively pronounced cool water conditions. In China, this might be especially the northeast coastal area around Dalian. The question, however, is when the historic process of empire building started out from other regions that are weak in cool water, and then the cool water regions become part of that empire by conquest. The cool water features, of course, will not transpire with the expected consequences as there would be if those areas would have developed on their own without foreign interference or conquest. Russia is another example. We do not know how the few liberal elements in Russia's history, thinking of the trade city Novgorod or the Cossack republics, how those elements would have played out against the authoritarian tendencies of the country had that country not been under Mongol rule for several hundred years.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There are more questions coming, and a couple of them are just clarification questions. And the first comes from Maria Kravtsova, who says whether she's right that, let me see it, whether she's right that democratic regime cannot drive people's values towards higher emancipative values. So if we have more democracy than it is predicted by emancipative values, it does not create more favorable conditions for acquiring emancipative values. So I think the answer is yes, but maybe Chris, you want to elaborate.
The answer is a definitive yes. And if you would go back to slide number 5, there was a second figure in the lower part this time, where I tried to look whether value change over 30 years is a function of how strongly the culture was misfitting the regime. And the explained variance in that exercise, so this is trying to reverse the causal error. So now I'm looking whether when the regime is more democratic than we would think, does that over time increase the emancipative values? Or when the regime is more autocratic than we would otherwise think, would that lower the emancipative values in a country? And there is no relationship. It's zero explained variance. The regression line actually is a completely flat line. It's a horizontal line with no slope at all. So values do not change as a function of their misfit to the given regime. But regimes do change as a function to the misfit to the values given at a certain point in time. I think this should strike us as a quite conclusive test of causality. Of course, without experimental control, we can never ultimately nail down causality, but this brings us a good step closer to lend credibility that the causality is going in one direction and not the other.
And the other clarification question is in the same direction. It comes from Camille Barca. I hope I pronounced this right. What are your arguments or evidence regarding the direction of the relationship, that is, population's values influencing the political system and not the opposite? So I think it comes from the fact that the misfit in culture and values explains regime change, but not the value change. But please, if you want to elaborate further.
You just gave the answer.
Yeah. Then there is not so much a question, but a comment from Misho Minkov, who writes, what Felhelm measures in China may not be an individualistic collectivistic distinction. He measures some types of independence. Recent work on that, Vignol et al., suggested that there are many types of independence, and most are not related to individualistic collectivistic as measured by me, Welzel, and others.
it's bad luck for me that Misho is familiar with the Rice collectivism theory. I just used to mention it because it just fits my storyline so well. But I am aware that there is a discussion about this theory because there are problems on the operationalization and the measurements, and I would agree with that.
Okay, the next one comes from Vladimir Magun. May I ask Chris to comment on the recent Russian history after 1991 from the point of view of the culture regime fit?
Yes, I think Russia would be another example where the process of democratization went farther than the culture or the level of emancipative values would actually support. And Putin was the one who turned it back towards where the culture supports it. So I think that backsliding, as political scientists call it, on levels of democracy that happened after Putin was actually such a correction of a previous misfit.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Nada Amin. She writes, since you mentioned earlier the clientelism and tribalism in the Middle East as obvious authoritarian values, is it possible that their rentier economy is the reason that these values are less likely to change easily or even at all?
I would say yes. It's also an important point because I don't like to look that much anymore on per capita GDP as the major indicator of development or modernization, for that matter, because the structure of the economy is just as important. And many of the Gulf states, Middle Eastern states, are patrimonial rentier states. And that means even though the per capita GDP might be super high, as in Qatar or whatever, Bahrain or the Emirates, the structure of the economy is such that the normal emancipatory consequences that we normally expect from such high levels of development do not kick in. Another structural element, also there's a new book about the autocratic middle class. The traditional democratic theory suggests that when middle classes are growing, this creates democratization pressures. But this book makes the observation that in many newly developing countries, the middle class that is created or emerging is a middle class that is occupied in state-sponsored parts of the economy, in which case, because of this dependence, this emancipatory spirit that would drive people to demand, democracy does not kick in. So we have also to look at the structure of the economy, not only at the level of material affluence.
All right. The next one comes from Didem Ischi. I hope I pronounced this right. Do you have any explanation regarding Turkey's recent regime change towards a presidential system in terms of the culture regime misfit viewpoint?
I had to look up what the misfit score was, but I think many mechanisms that we observe in Russia and in Turkey, and there is certain similarities if we look at Erdogan and Putin and other such leaders, thinking of Bolsonaro, Duterte, an increasing species actually, that there are similar mechanisms at work. So that countries under a zeitgeist of democratic euphoria, many countries move to levels of democracy that actually are not supported by the culture in terms of its values that are prevalent. And that is always the opportunity window that such leaders then take advantage of to turn the regime into an opposite direction. Maybe not entirely, but partially. So we have now a lot of what political scientists call electoral autocracies. Yeah, what we see, for instance, in the trend also in the VDEM data, what we call closed autocracies. So this is autocracies that really do not hold elections, like Saudi Arabia or China. Closed autocracies have really shrank over time. So there are much less of them than there used to be before the 1990s. But this has not been meant a real increase in full or fully fledged democracies. But what has really increased is the number of electoral autocracies, where we have regimes that hold elections. The elections are competitive. Opposition is allowed, but the playing field is highly uneven in favor of the incumbents.
Like pound soup, or are you sitting there naked watching something?
Okay.
If I could follow up on this a little, you seem to be saying that the most recent wave of democratization was not fully warranted by the values many of these countries had. And what is the policy implication here? Does it mean that in this wave of democratization, oftentimes there was basically a waste of resources, sometimes lives, and you know, a bitter disappointment eventually, and they would, some of these countries would be just as good if nothing happened?
Well, I would say one implication is that foreign democracy promotion does not work if this is not met by domestic forces that are strong. What happened in the past is, I think we have to figure in here the international system, of course. We had a phase after the Cold War ended, when the Soviet Empire collapsed, and the Western powers were pretty much dictating terms and conditions, for instance, on development aid and other things, that from the international systems incentive structure was such that many countries, elites, had an incentive to introduce elections and other elements of democracy in order to get access to development aid, or to increase their reputation in the world arena. And that led in many countries to processes of democratization where the domestic forces were actually not there. Now we are in a very different situation. I call it in the article that I have circulated, anti-democratic scripts of modernity. Yeah, anti-democratic scripts of modernity. And China and Russia are the proponents of those scripts. They are arguing there are other ways than the Western liberal democracy way to modernity, and we show it how it works. And those actors are now having and gaining weight in the international arena, and that also means that from the viewpoint of the international system, the incentive structure is no longer working so strongly in favor of democracy, because there are now potent alternative models of modernization, some of which are outright anti-democratic. And therefore, elites in many countries are now having more choices in terms of do they find China's way more attractive or the Western way more attractive.
Okay. A question from, I guess we still have a little bit time, from Feliz Aydın. What are the implications of your theory? I mean, if the people's values are not emancipatory, then shouldn't we push people towards democracy as Kemalism and Westernists did in Turkey or liberals did in Russia? I think you kind of just have answered this. So the question is, the answer is basically yes. What you said, that if the foreign promotion of democracy is not supported by strong domestic forces based in people's values, it will not work, right? And there's another comment from Misho Minkov. I wish Tony Blair was in attendance. Some 20 years ago, he stated that the view that real democracy is not possible everywhere on earth was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. In my view, his statement was the most stupid I had ever heard.
Yeah, this is actually, I would fully agree with this. And therefore, it's another reason why I call it a cultural theory of autocracy versus democracy, because in my view, it is not so that every culture is equally compatible with democracy. That we also see that in the one finding that is reported in the paper, that if we divide the countries up into the 12 culture zones on the globe, and we look at how much variance in autocracy versus democracy is explained by culture zone membership, it's the constant 70% over the last 120 years, despite all the trending patterns and waves of democratization, reverse waves, and the other trending patterns. Despite these trending patterns, this is a constant rate, and what is behind it is that even though the world on average has certainly become democratic over the last 120 years, but at the forefront of democracy at its given time, we always find those countries that are core countries of the West at any given point in time. So it's a culture-specific phenomenon. It's not culturally universal or universally applicable unless emancipative values diffuse in a stronger manner into non-Western culture zones.
Thank you. Another question from M. Filipov. Based on your theory, could we expect that those who moved from Russia to Germany and formed their communities would preserve their true non-democratic nature?
Probably the glass is half full and half empty in this case. The most I know about migration studies and cultural acculturation is that migrants do preserve a part of their origin culture, but they also adjust and move towards the culture of their new home. And then with generational change, one has to hope that a certain assimilation will happen. We know this at least from Turkish immigrants in Germany. I haven't seen data on Russian immigrants in Germany, but I would assume that similar processes of like preservance and acculturation are on the way.
And maybe one of the last questions from Natalia Soboleva. What can we do with the measurement of democracy? Maybe it should be reformulated. As you say, people understand differently in different countries. Does this depend only on emancipative values or on other factors?
Indeed, we have measures of what people mean when they say democracy, and we have found that there are surprisingly strong differences, because political science literature so far has assumed that when people support democracy, they have all the same thing in mind. This is not at all the case. In some countries, people have what I called in a paper authoritarian misunderstandings of democracy, and they think autocracy is democracy. Many people think that. And this is in direct dependence on their level of emancipative values. We find this misperception only among people who are weak in emancipative values. When they are strong in emancipative values, they don't have such misunderstandings.
All right. There is also a technical question, I guess, to be addressed to Natalia Soboleva. Natalia, someone is wondering whether the record of this presentation will be available.
Okay, to be honest, it's the first time I tried the recording, but I think if Chris allows and if the recording worked, we can put it somewhere in the website. So if
So,
yes.
What'd you say, Chris?
No, I'm joking. Yes, of course, no problem.
All right. So maybe it's a good time to stop here and thank Chris because he has another appointment at 6, as I understand.
No,
maybe you need a break
to
have a coffee or something between the two meetings.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to
Thank you. Terrific.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.
Bye.